From the heart of Africa, Burkina Faso shines anew.
The Africa spoke. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African stories.
There were no fireworks, no national holiday, no CNN coverage, just a quiet government announcement that barely made the news. And then, the ground began to shake. Across the vast Sahel and deep into Santa Sud, bulldozers, road rollers, and heavy machines appeared like ghosts rising from the earth. Villagers stopped. Children stood on rooftops. For the first time, they saw black asphalt curling toward their doorsteps like a promise never made before. Burkina Faso, a poor, landlocked African nation with a GDP smaller than some U.S. cities, had just declared the impossible. It would build the largest road network in African history, without a single loan from the World Bank, without a signature from the IMF, without waiting for any green light from Washington, Brussels, or Paris. The world laughed. But while they laughed, Fossomebo began. No fancy consultants, no foreign engineers, no white papers, just the hands of ordinary citizens, students, farmers, young people once unemployed or ready to flee to Europe, now rising to build their country with their own hands. And the price tag? $200 billion. That's 10 times the nation's GDP. But the people didn't blink. They didn't ask for permission. They asked, when do we start? So the question now for all of us watching from afar is this. Can a nation once abandoned by global finance and ignored by the world really rise by paving its own way, literally 1 kilometer at a time? And is President Ibrahim Traoré leading a miracle in the making, or a defiance doomed to fail? It started without noise, but with enormous weight. While much of the world remained preoccupied with headlines from Europe, tech stocks, and election debates, something was quietly unfolding in the heart of West Africa, something so ambitious, so unprecedented, that many simply refused to believe it was real. Burkina Faso, a country long described as the dead end of infrastructure investment, announced it would build more than 5,000 kilometers of national roads, entirely on its own. No outside contractors, no donor conferences, no strings attached. Just 2 months after the announcement, more than 900 pieces of heavy construction equipment, bulldozers, rollers, graders, were not only purchased, not leased, but deployed to every single province in the country. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a fully operational mobilization. No World Bank logos adorned the trucks, no European flags flew over the sites. Instead, each machine bore the Burkina Faso national insignia, and the operators were not expats flown in from Paris or Washington, but local youth, many of whom had never touched a machine in their lives just months earlier. They were trained quickly, on-site, and given real responsibility. One former sugarcane juice vendor now commands a 50-person road crew. Another young man, once preparing to migrate across the Mediterranean, returned to his village to supervise asphalt pouring along the road he had once dreamed of escaping from. There was no blueprint for what Burkina Faso was doing. This wasn't a model project. It wasn't a pilot. It was a nationwide commitment, a declaration of intent on the scale of a war effort. And make no mistake, this was war. Not a war with guns, but a war for sovereignty. A battle against decades of dependency on institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, whose loans, while labeled as development, often left behind more bureaucracy than progress. For years, every dollar that flowed into Burkina Faso from abroad came with a price: structural adjustments, budget cuts, opening up mining rights to foreign corporations, and hiring foreign experts who didn't speak the local languages, didn't understand the land, and left once the funding ran dry. Under President Ibrahim Traoré, that era is being challenged head-on. Instead of waiting for aid, Burkina Faso turned inward. The entire project was self-financed, not through foreign credit, but through 3 internal sources. 1. Revenue from gold mining and reclaiming control over natural resources. 2. Domestic taxation on previously exempt multinational companies. 3. cutting unnecessary government spending and redirecting it to core infrastructure. That's how the impossible 200 billion figure started to make sense, not as a number on paper, but as a redistribution of sovereignty. Each province was turned into a construction command zone. Each project team functioned like a battalion. Deadlines were issued, GPS tracking was installed, aerial drones were used for supervision. Work went on day and night. In rebel-held red zones, roadwork continued under headlights at midnight. Crews were escorted by national forces. They weren't waiting for peace talks. They were building through the conflict. One engineer said, "We don't ask if it's safe, we ask if it's necessary." That philosophy defined the DNA of Fossomebo. It did not operate like a ministry. It did not host press briefings. It didn't apply for environmental approvals from global agencies. It simply started building. Every kilometer completed was not just asphalt. It was proof. Proof that the people of Burkina Faso could shape their own destiny without permission, without praise, and without external approval. This wasn't just a story of building roads. It was the story of building dignity. In a world where the narrative about Africa is often dominated by need, crisis, or conflict, Fossomebo offered a different picture of a country rising from within, one stretch of pavement at a time. As the machines rolled and the asphalt stretched across forgotten landscapes, something even more remarkable began to happen. People stopped fleeing. For decades, Burkina Faso's story was one of quiet desperation. Its youth either disappeared into the shadows of unemployment or vanished across borders in search of better lives. Its rural villages were dotted with collapsed schools, broken roads, and hospitals that hadn't seen medicine in months. It was a nation slowly bleeding, not just economically but spiritually. But Fossomebo began to turn the tide. In one remote province, a young woman who once studied engineering only to be told she'd never be taken seriously now manages 8 kilometers of active construction. She doesn't work behind a desk. She walks with mud on her boots and blueprints in her hands. "I used to be called a girl who studied engineering to get married," she said, standing under the Sahel sun. "Now I'm building the road my future children will drive on." In another village, young men who once planned to stow away on cargo trucks bound for Libya returned home to build. They operate concrete mixers, led survey teams, and wear uniforms marked not with donor logos, but with the colors of their own republic. The construction sites became classrooms. The dirt roads became training grounds. Fossomebo didn't just create jobs, it created a culture of responsibility. The government structured each team like a military unit. A lead engineer also handled finances. Each group had supervisors, apprentices, and real deadlines. Every delay was tracked. Every kilometer was monitored by GPS, photographed and sent in reports, not to some foreign boardroom, but to a central command in Ouagadougou run by fellow Burkinabe. There were no foreigners in hard hats giving orders. There were no expats holding clipboards. There were no permission slips handed down from Brussels or Geneva. And that's where the world began to take notice. While Western media still mostly ignored the story, whispers began to spread in development circles. How could a poor country with no coastline, few roads, and a history of coups pull off a $200 billion infrastructure campaign without aid? The reactions ranged from disbelief to condescension. Some labeled it unsustainable. Others called it reckless. A few development pundits mocked the government's estimates. No feasibility studies, no independent audits, no governance safeguards. To many in Washington and Paris, it felt like Burkina Faso was playing with fire. But the people on the ground didn't care. A farmer in Kaya put it best. "We used to wait for roads. Now we build them. Let them laugh." Meanwhile, across Burkina Faso, change was no longer just political. It became physical. In villages where schools had closed for years, teachers returned because they could now drive in safely. Clinics once cut off by seasonal floods began receiving steady deliveries of medicine. Children who had never seen electricity walked home on newly paved roads lit by solar lamps installed at intersections. And it wasn't just services that came back. It was hope. Young people who had once known only survival now talked about becoming engineers, site managers, or even starting their own firms. Some former trainees from Fossomebo launched private infrastructure training centers, run by locals for locals. Entire families moved back to their hometowns. Mechanics, telecom technicians, and school teachers left the overcrowded capital to rebuild their communities. The phrase returning home no longer meant failure. It meant opportunity. This was the turning point. The climax of Fossomebo wasn't a single event. It wasn't a ribbon cutting or a presidential speech. It was the collective moment when the nation chose to believe in itself. It was when mothers stopped crying over washed-out roads. When a bag of onions no longer took 3 days and 2 collapsed bridges to reach market. When men who had planned to cross the sea began paving roads instead. The world still might not believe it. But in Burkina Faso, no one is waiting for belief. They're busy building. When a road opens, it does more than let cars pass. In Burkina Faso, each new stretch of asphalt is a lifeline, connecting what was once isolated, empowering those long forgotten, and quietly redrawing the map of political power in a country once paralyzed by distance. Before Fossomebo, nearly every major road led to the capital, Ouagadougou. Resources, talent, jobs, everything flowed inward. Rural towns withered, markets collapsed under the weight of transportation costs. A teacher in the north might wait 6 months for chalk. A clinic in the east might lose lives because a bridge was out during the rainy season. But Fossomebo reversed that current. For the first time in living memory, roads flowed outward. And with them came new life. In Tuai province in the southwest, once dismissed as too remote to matter, business registrations surged by over 220% in just 4 months after the interprovincial road was completed. Farmers who once lost 40% of their crop value in transit now drove their produce straight to distribution centers in under 4 hours. Villages that had markets only once a week now held them daily. Women's cooperatives formed, pooling resources to hire trucks and sell their goods without middlemen. And with roads came digital access. Mobile money transactions tripled in some regions, bringing financial inclusion to areas that had never had a bank branch. But the economic ripple was just the beginning. A deeper transformation took root, the return of trust in the state. In countries where governments have long failed to deliver even the most basic services, state legitimacy can wither. People don't vote. They don't complain. They simply stop expecting anything. Fossomebo began to change that. Not because of speeches, not because of slogans, but because people could see, touch, and walk on what their government had promised and delivered. This kind of civic proof, visible, practical, and unshakable, shifted the mood of a nation. In local councils, citizen engagement rose. People started showing up to community meetings again. Parents demanded school improvements because they knew the school wasn't 5 hours away anymore. It was across the new road. Health workers volunteered for rural assignments they once avoided. When the state builds a road, it doesn't just connect villages. It moves its presence closer. And when people feel seen, they respond, not with gratitude, but with expectation. Expectation, in politics, is a form of power. Burkina Faso's centralized government began to face a new challenge: decentralized accountability. With roads came new economic centers. With new centers came new voices. People no longer waited to go to the capital to be heard. They expected to be heard where they were. And they started organizing. In the Sahel region, once destabilized by insurgencies, a chain of roadside markets now supports over 10,000 weekly transactions. These are no longer just trade hubs. They are forums of community where young leaders are emerging not through elections or appointments, but through action, building logistics systems, organizing supply chains, mediating disputes. This is grassroots governance, born from asphalt, not ideology. At the national level, politicians who once campaigned on abstract reform now faced new demands: real infrastructure, real services, real follow-through. And in response, ministries were forced to adapt. The Ministry of Planning partnered with provinces to support industrial parks and logistics hubs along the Fossomebo corridors. The Ministry of Education revised school deployment maps to follow the new roads. The Ministry of Health restructured supply chains, anchoring them to the newly accessible rural clinics. The civil service, once sluggish and centralized, began shifting toward a mobile, responsive, field-based model. Bureaucracy, long a tool of delay, was slowly becoming a tool of delivery. And through it all, President Ibrahim Traoré's image evolved, not just as a young leader with a military past, but as the face of a generation trying to rebuild a nation with its own bare hands. Critics still warn of the risks: lack of oversight, centralized control, uneven rollout. But even they admit something is happening that hasn't happened in decades. The people of Burkina Faso are starting to believe that government can work if it works with them. And in an age where trust in institutions is eroding everywhere, that may be the boldest revolution of all. From Washington to Brussels, the reaction to Fossomebo has been strangely quiet. In think tanks, analysts are puzzled. In media rooms, the story barely makes the ticker. And in diplomatic circles, there's an unmistakable air of hesitation. Why? Because what's happening in Burkina Faso doesn't fit the usual narrative. A poor African nation, led by a post-coup military leader, rejecting foreign aid and succeeding without Western oversight? That's not the script global development institutions are used to. In Washington, policymakers see a paradox. On the one hand, they champion African self-reliance. On the other, Fossomebo exposes just how irrelevant many international aid structures have become, at least in the eyes of those who never benefited from them. The U.S. has long promoted development through large-scale funding, technical assistance, and conditional reforms. Yet here is Burkina Faso, ignoring all of that and instead turning its own young people into engineers, planners, and entrepreneurs without a dollar from the IMF or World Bank. In private, some Western officials have expressed admiration for the audacity, but publicly, few dare endorse it. Why? Because if Fossomebo succeeds, it sets a precedent that challenges the legitimacy of the aid industrial complex itself, and that raises uncomfortable questions. What if Africa doesn't need to be saved, but simply left alone to build? What if real development doesn't come from outside grants, but from internal will? For American audiences, especially those who've supported foreign aid for decades, Fossomebo invites a moment of reflection. Are our dollars really empowering people? Or are they sometimes standing in the way of what real empowerment looks like? President Ibrahim Traoré's silence toward the West speaks volumes. He isn't asking for attention. He isn't asking for funds. He's asking for space. And perhaps that's what makes Fossomebo the most radical political act in today's Africa. Not a demand for support, but a refusal to ask at all. Fossomebo isn't just a construction project. It's a signal that something is shifting, not only in Burkina Faso, but across an entire continent that has long waited for someone else's permission to grow. We've spent decades hearing about Africa's potential, future markets, future leaders, future solutions. But in Burkina Faso, the future is already underway, not in boardrooms or conferences, but on the ground, kilometer by kilometer. This isn't a miracle. It's not even perfect. There are risks. There are flaws. There will be mistakes. But what's happening cannot be dismissed, because in a world where debt is growing, trust is fading, and institutions are struggling to adapt. A country that dares to build without asking first is a country worth watching. It's also a country worth listening to. When roads open, they don't just carry trucks and produce. They carry ideas. They carry expectations. And eventually, they carry change. Change that cannot be reversed once people have seen that a different way is possible. For Americans who care deeply about how our tax dollars are used abroad, for those who've supported development in Africa through donations, church missions, or policy, Fossomebo invites a quiet question. Do we still believe that foreign assistance is the only road forward? Or is it time to support those who are paving their own way, without us? President Ibrahim Traoré may not be on the cover of the New York Times, but in the eyes of many Africans, he's already drawn a new map, one that no longer points north for help, but points inward for strength. If you believe in an Africa that no longer needs rescuing, if you believe that a road can change destiny, if you believe that faith without works is dead, then maybe it's time we stop watching and start walking with them. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines, and comment below. Can we continue to trust Traoré's vision, or is it too bold to succeed?